Piecewise functions is probably one of the strangest things that you're going to see this year. You may end up wanting to watch this video a couple times just to get the hang of it, which is one of the nice reasons for the videos for this. So what happens with a piecewise function is you're actually going to get two different equations depending on what x values you're talking about. We're going to use the top equation when you have x values that are smaller than or equal to 1. That's what this is for. We're going to use the bottom one when you have x values bigger than 1. And so to graph this, what I suggest doing is making an xy axis, or sorry, t-table. And then this point right here is going to be a place that you're going to balance out your table. So I'm going to use blue here to start with. 1 is a very important number here, and we're actually going to do 1 twice. For the top equation, it says x is smaller than or equal to 1, so I'm going to pick x values smaller than or equal to 1. And here I have a couple. And then since I'm working with the top equation, I'm going to start plugging those in. So I've got 2 times 1 minus 1, so I'm plugging into the top equation, and I get 1. Then I plug in 0, and I get negative 1. Plug in negative 1, and I get negative 3. And then I plug in negative 2, and I get negative 5. So I can graph those points. When I'm looking at this first one, 1 equals 1, so when x is 1, y is 1, I also have to look up here and say that this is including the 1, so I got to use a closed circle for this one. So I have x is 1, y is 1, a closed circle there. And then my next point is 0, negative 1, and then negative 1, negative 3, and negative 2, negative 5. And then this is saying for all values smaller than or equal to 1, so this line will actually continue going in this direction. I'm not going to go in the other direction, because if I went this way, then I'd be including these x values which are bigger than 1. So if I actually want to include those values that are bigger than 1, then I'm going to look at the other equation, because this equation says that x is greater than 1. So now you'll notice on my table I actually put another 1 on there, and that one is going to be for when we have an x value bigger than 1. So I'm going to pick numbers that are bigger than 1, and we're going to plug those into the bottom equation. So I plug in 3 times 1 plus 1, that gives me 4. Then I have 3 times 2 plus 1, that gives me 7. And 3 times 3 plus 1, that gives me 10. And 3 times 4 plus 1 gives me 13. So then I can graph those points. So when x is 1, y is 4, but I have to be careful because you'll notice up here it says that x is bigger than 1. And since I don't have that line underneath, I have to do an open circle for this point. So when x is 1, y is 4, I have to put an open circle there. And then when x is 2, y is 7. When x is 3, y is 10. Uh-oh, I'm off here. Oh, that point wasn't. Sorry. Alright, let's see if I can count correctly. 1, 2, 3, 4. I have to put an open circle. And then I have 7, fill that in, and then 10, and keep on going. And so everything goes there in that direction, because all of these values are bigger than 1. And I can't include 1, but everything above it, including all the fractions that go above it. So this is the graph, and it just depends on where you are on the graph for which your value is going to be. So you see the next question here says, find f of 0, f of 2, and f of 4. Now what's tricky about that is you have to know, are you using the top equation or are you using the bottom equation? So when we're looking at f of 0, 0 is smaller than 1, so I'm going to use the top equation. So f of 0 equals, top equation, 2 times 0 minus 1, which will be 0 minus 1 is negative 1. Now to find f of 2, again now I have to look at these guys over here. And 2 is bigger than 1, so I'm going to use the bottom equation. So we have 3 times 2 plus 1 gives me 7. And then f of 4. Okay, 4 is bigger than 1, so I use the bottom equation again. I've got 3 times 4 plus 1 gives me 13. Let's try another problem. The only way you're going to really get this is by practicing. So here I have my two equations again. This time my magic number is 2. You'll see that it's based around the number 2. So if I want to try and graph this, again I'll set up a table. This time my table is going to be centered around the number 2. So on the top it talks about x values less than 2, so I'll pick some values less than 2. I'll plug them in to the top equation. 2 plus 2 is 4. 1 plus 2 is 3. and 0 plus 2 is 2. So if I graph those, notice up here that it's just less than 2, so I have to be careful that I put an open circle. So when x is 0, y is 2. Oh wait, nope. It's best to start down here with that 2. So when x is 2, y is 4, and so that's going to be my open circle. Then I can go to 1 and 3, and then 0 and 2, and then I can continue my line going that way with the arrow. Okay, now for the other side of the equation, we have our bottom one, and this one is saying x is bigger than or equal to 2. So I plug in 2 to the bottom equation, and I get 5, and then plug in 3, 7, and then plug in 4 plus 1 equals 9. Alright, so once again I start with the 2 this time. Notice it has a line underneath, so I can include the 2, so I can include that point. So we get 2 and 5, so it's going to be solid, filled in circle. And then 3 and 7, and 4 and 9. And so my graph goes up this way, and that's that side of the graph. Now once again I want to find my f of 0, f of 3, and f of 6. And once again I need to pay attention to where the x is. Here I'm looking at x is 0, and 0 is less than 2, so I'm going to use the top equation. So we have 0 plus 2 equals 2. Then I'm going to try 3. 3 is bigger than 2, so I'm going to go with the bottom one. And then we'll try 6. 6 is once again bigger than 2, so we go with the bottom one. And we get 13. Alright, next one again. You're only going to get this if we practice, so let's try it here. I'll go back to black here, draw my XY axes. I'm going to draw a table here. Alright, ask yourself, what is this centered around? What number are we going to center this around? And hopefully you're saying 3. So I'm going to draw my line here, 3 above and a 3 below. Now the first equation says x is smaller than 3, so we'll give a value smaller than 3. And we plug them in the top equation. 3 times 3 plus 2 gives me 11. 3 times 2 plus 2 gives me 8. 3 times 1 plus 2 gives me 5. And 3 times 0 plus 2 gives me 2. Now this is saying x is less than or equal to 3, so we get to do a closed circle because it's also equal to. And we've got 3 and 11. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. Closed circle. Then we've got 2 and 8. 10, 9, 8. And then we've got 1 and 5. 7, 6, 5. And then we've got 0 and 2. And we can keep on going in that direction. And that'll be the bottom half. Then we'll go to the other one. This is saying x is bigger than 3, so I'm going to pick numbers bigger than 3 and plug those into the bottom one. So we got 3 minus 1 is 2. And then we've got 4 minus 1 is 3. And 5 minus 1 is 4. So now as I graph these, I have to do open circle. And when I start with 3, we've got 2. So it's an open circle. Then we go to 4 and I get 3. Then we go to 5 and I get 4. And so my graph is going to look like that. This one's kind of weird looking, but that is it. Alright. So I actually suggest you try graphing this on your own before I do it. Okay, we've been graphing quite a bit. So, here we go. We start with our table. I'm actually going to go kind of fast. If you need to slow me down, go ahead and do that. But I'm seeing the length is getting a little bit long here, and I don't want you to be stuck with this for too long. So we start with our XY table. I'm focusing this around the number 1. So I'll put a 1 above and below. And then we'll just go with, the top one says x is smaller than 1. So I'll plug in a couple there. So I plug in 1. I get 1/2 times 1 plus 3/2. 1/2 times 1 is 1/2, so I get 4/2, which is 2. Then I plug in 0, and I get 0 plus 3 halves then, which is going to be 3 halves. And then I plug in negative 1, 1 half times negative 1 plus 3 halves. Okay, 1 half, that's a negative, plus 3 halves gives me 2 over 2, which is 1. Now this is going to be an open circle because it just says x is less than 1. So when we're doing the 1 comma 2, we're going to do an open circle. Then I go to 0 and 3 halves, and then negative 1 and 1. And there's my graph. Okay, for the other side of it, now I'm looking at numbers bigger than 1. So I've got 1, 2, and 3. I'll plug those in the bottom one. So I get negative 1 plus 3 is 2, negative 2 plus 3 is 1, and negative 3 plus 3 is 0. Now this one, x is less than or equal to, it's got that equal to sign, so I get to put a solid line, or solid dot. X is 1, y is 2. Now you'll notice I'm actually going to fill in what I had before because both of these gave us the same answer. And then we got 2, 1, and 3, 0. And there's the other side of the graph. So this one actually makes a corner and they connect. Not always going to be the case. All right. For this one, our last problem, we have that it's centered around the number 2. So as I go like this, I'm going to put a 2 above and 2 below. And let's see here. So if I pick numbers, the top one, notice the top one has numbers bigger than 2. And then the bottom one has numbers less than 2. It's kind of odd. So I always do the less than ones up here because that's just how a table works. We typically start with smaller numbers and then work our way down. So I'm going to go with the smaller numbers here. So that means we plug in the bottom one. So we've got negative 2 plus 1 gives me negative 1. And then negative 1 plus 1 gives me 0. And then negative 0 plus 1 gives me 1. Now this has a less than and equal to, so I'm going to do my full circle. So at 2, x is 2, y is negative 1, it's a filled in circle. Then when x is 1, y is 0. And when x is 0, y is 1. So we've got this arrow that goes this way. And then for the numbers bigger than, we're plugging in the top one. So I plug in 2, and then it's going to be 2 over 1. If I plugged in 2, it's 2 over 1. So I get 4 thirds plus 2 thirds gives me 6 thirds, which is 2. Then I plug in 3, which 3 times 2 is 6. So I get 6 thirds plus 2 thirds gives me 8 thirds, which is 2 and 2 thirds. And if I plug in 4, I've got 8 thirds plus 2 thirds, which is 10 thirds, which gives me 3 and a third. These aren't the best numbers to work with, but they are what they are. Now it's just x is greater than 2, so this is going to be open circle. So when we have 2, y is 2, it's an open circle. And then when we have 3, we get 2 and 2 thirds. And then when we have 4, we get 3 and 1 third. So it's a really shallow line going like that.